Okay, so we've just gone through this very laborious look at the compound. Now we're trying to figure out how we will best understand it in our text. So there's really only, I'm showing you principles of scriptural exegesis, and I'm showing you, it's very laborious to get there, but I'm showing you a process which must be used to come to conclusions regarding Scripture. I don't just say, oh, this is that. So I'm not making these available because they're terribly scratchy, but I am going to share with you. We're going to look up some of these occurrences where this word kathekon is occurring, but we do not see it. We're reading English, of course, so we're going to try and go through these pretty quick, otherwise I'll be here all night. Matthew 21:38. I'm praying I took these down right. This is the wicked husbandman. And verse 38 says, "But when the husbandmen saw the son, they said amongst themselves, or among themselves, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and let us seize on his inheritance." So the word "seize on" is the same word that's being used in our text of 2 Thessalonians 2:6 and 7. If you can even wrap your mind around that. Now, are they in the same form? No. This is a different declension. Well, it's actually conjugation per se for non-grammar folks. But they're saying, let us go and take possession of. Remember, I just finished going down some of those things to possess, right, in my definitions of eco, right? To take possession of. So you get an idea right there. That's one place where it occurs in the King James where you wouldn't really imagine it. Now, go with me to Luke 4:42. This is what crazy people do. You know, you write out stuff because you just have nothing better to do, and then you even tag it, which I did. So Luke 4:42, "And when it was day, he departed and went into a desert place. And the people sought him and came unto him and stayed him." And there's your word again, "and stayed him," "that he should not depart from them." Here, the meaning is very clear. They were trying to hinder, they were trying to prevent. We're going to try and color this in. They were not trying to possess him, right? Although that's another demon somewhere else. But let's just say that they were trying to retain him, hinder him. They were trying to prevent him from departing. Okay, here we go. Luke 8:15. Luke 8:15 is the explanation of the parable of the sower. This actually, the method of this is to show you how many different places this occurs. It's all the same word, and yet look at how the King James translators translated each one of these in very different ways. Luke 8:15, "But that on good ground are they, which in an honest and good heart having heard the word, keep it." That's your word again. Keep it. "And bring forth fruit with patience," or endurance. So they retain it. They retain it. They possess it in the sense that they hold on to it. They treasure it with ongoing effects, by the way, because it's active, present and active. So when it says they keep it, by the way, this ought to shoot in the foot some people that talk about the concept of hearing something once, or once saved, always saved, because this is ongoing. They keep it. So in this sense, I would say possess as in to have, possession to have, to hold, to keep. Let's do another one. Luke 14:9. And I'm now only going to read the area. This is about taking the high room, and you should take the low room first. And I'm reading 14:9, just a snippet, so I don't go through the labor of reading the whole thing, which you can do in your own time. Thou begin with shame to take the lowest room. There's your word again, to take. And here we would say to take or to occupy. And from that respect, occupation with the sense of even temporary attempt to possess. Not full-on possession, but taking a place you're not entitled to take or you shouldn't take. But I want you to harness onto the idea of occupying, the concept of to have, to take, or to occupy. Oh, there's a lot more here. We'll go to the one that actually says hold, so you can get an idea. And I want to turn there with you. And that you'll find in Romans 1:18. Actually using the word hold. Remarkable that they did that. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. To hold the truth. There we might say, indeed, to possess, to retain. I want you to flip-flop. As we're going through these words, they do have, for the most part, except for the one where they stayed him, they didn't try to possess him, although they may have been possessive in their intention, but they did not try to possess him. But you can see that there is a tendency to translate this word with the sense of possession, occupy, to have, to hold, to retain. It's a very, very difficult word to translate. Wait, there's more. Let's go to the one where it actually uses the word possessed, the word for possessed. That's in 1 Corinthians. I'm skipping over a few. 1 Corinthians 7:30. And they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not. So you get the sense here. They're using it right there just as it's written, as though they had no possessions. Other times in 1 Corinthians 11:2, 1 Corinthians 15:2, to keep the ordinances, to keep in memory, to retain. I'm now to retain, to possess, to hold, to adhere to. Then we have some kind of anomalous ones because they actually use the word hold fast. 1 Thessalonians 5. We're almost done with this exercise here, so bear with me. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Now, some of you may recall this word occurred in Hebrews, and I'll give you the three occurrences, 3:6, 3:14, and 10:23. And three of those occurrences are somewhat identical in the use that's occurring here in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. I'm going to read real quickly the references in Hebrews. If we hold fast the confidence, which is referring to our faith, it is our faith. Let's just leave it at that. If we hold the beginning, again referring to our faith, and let us hold fast to the profession, referring to our faith. All right? So when hold fast is used, and I said this when I taught in Hebrews, I think I used the word like cleats, digging in, taking hold. I don't know if any of you remember that, but that's how I used it. And I hadn't even dug this far. See, I'm just full of puns. So it's very clear that there is a concept in this word that pretty much is being understood universal. We say between this and that range: to occupy, to possess, to cleave or cling to, in the sense of possessing it, but with the intent to not let go, which I would say hold fast might be just like that. And then we have our words, the two occurrences in 2 Thessalonians 2 and 6. And here comes the problem. Unlike all of these other occurrences, and I parsed all of them, the blue on my paper is parsed. Unlike all of these two, 2 Thessalonians 2:6 and 2:7, have some very interesting issues. First of all, the only occurrence in 2 Thessalonians 2:6 of the what's being translated withholdeth is in the neutral, the neuter. It has no gender. It's genderless. Now, this is where I'm just going to put it out there, and I need people to recognize. You see the amount of work I put into things. It's not so I can make some proclamation and say, okay, now you can just do whatever. There's a method to this, which is lining up all these words and then recognizing that if we're going to try and determine the what, let's go back to the King James for a minute, that withholdeth. Let's kind of put in some pegs here. The what, that is neutral, it's not a man or a woman, that withholdeth, that we'll call it the one that is occupying, the one that is possessing, the one that is holding on, latched onto, which I tend to say is maybe not the right use. But you understand the words that I'm trying to get you to attach more so than the word to withhold. When I think of withhold, I think of withholding on somebody's paycheck, which does indeed mean to retain, but here it seems like it carries other connotations with it, and I want to try and avoid them. So I want you to think of having, to have, even to understand, to possess, to occupy, to retain, to detain. And I'm reluctant to use the word restrain. But let me stop there for a minute. So we have this word, and we're going to immediately say that this word occurring, occupying, possess, withholding, however you want to say it, which is an it, neutral. Second occurrence of the same word is in the masculine singular. Let's read the text again. And it's rather confusing. Did I take down my Greek? It's somewhere in here. There we go. This one is the morphologically tagged with direct English translations in red above it. I'm just going to put it there for just a second for you to see. Okay? Sorry, it just looks a little bit hard to read, but I at least can read it, so that's my problem. Okay. So I'm going to give you a literal of something, and then I'm going to go and see if the Greek New Testament here, which is using the New Revised Standard, we're going to see if we can come up with something that is fluid enough to grab hold of a concept. So first, word by word, starting at, I'm going to forget about going from 2:3 to get to my point here. So starting at 2:6. And now that, or which, it or what, now again, occupies, possesses, let's use the King James for a minute, withhold, retain, don't use the word hold fast, but cleave or cling. You know, for him to be revealed in his own time or season. For the mystery, so for the mystery of lawlessness is already working itself. It's already at work, but it's working itself. Only he who now occupies, possesses, retains, just keep going through the words, until out of the middle of the way he is removed. Now, I'm asking you to bear with me. This has boggled the mind. Had I known this, I have to be honest with you, I'm just going to be, had I known this was such a deep well, I probably would have said, hey guys, we're going to get to this next year. I would have said, let's, 50 sounds good, right? Like, let's do lunch. But the issue here is defining, and I'm going to go use some familiar terminology to you. If the reason why I'm reluctant to use the word restrain is if we use the terminology of occupy or possess, and we understand this neutral gender, that whatever it is that is possessing, occupying, restraining, let's go back to the King James, withholding, is neutral. And until this neutral force, what does the King James read? Until this neutral force, I'm going to add in a word, is removed, essentially taken out of the way, removed. The Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, cannot come to be. Something must happen first. Now, in our group of theories that I shared with you at the first part of the festival, broken into those categories are people who believe certain ways about the end time events. And how a person understands those events may or may not affect how you understand this text, or let's flip it. If you understand this text a certain way, you may hinge all of your eschatological understanding on a text that may not represent that specifically. You may find your doctrine elsewhere, but you may not find it here. So let me just cut to the chase. This requires that whatever the it is that is occupying, possessing, withholding, restraining, retaining, whatever the it is, requires that eventually the it, the neutral, also eventually becomes, in the same verb, masculine and singular. Traditionally, it has been taught that this it is the church. And there's only one problem with that. The Greek grammar prohibits it. The word ecclesia in the Greek is a feminine noun. Now, it's like, oh boy, what do you do with that? And so now here comes the journey, because like you, that is what I've understood all these years. It's the only problem is that you can't fit a feminine noun into a neutral verb. It doesn't work like that. They must be in agreement. Furthermore, what's even more perplexing is that whatever it is that is neutral, let's talk about it this way. Some people have proposed it's the church, but I just said the church is a feminine noun. It could be neutral. I just finished telling you about the Holy Spirit. Most people say, well, is that a tenable place to go if the Holy Spirit is removed? The only problem is what happens at the end of this verse, where it says, until he be taken out of the way, that he becomes a masculine singular. And if the Spirit is neutral, the Spirit would remain neutral all the way through. Does that make sense to you? The only other problem is that taken out of the way in the Greek, the verb genete does not have an active voice, which means that whoever he is, at the end, he must be removed, because it is actually in a middle or passive deponent, which means the person cannot remove themselves. Now, let's go through some thought process. Let's hypothesize for a minute. Let's just say that the first neutral fits the Holy Spirit, and let's just hypothesize that somewhere somebody made a scribal error, there's something wrong, I'm trying to think of excuses. The only problem is that the Holy Spirit would have the power to remove himself. I'm referring to him as a he, but it's actually neutral. So this whole passage is fraught with incredible problems. Now, anybody in the sound of my voice who proposes that they understand this text perfectly is probably a liar. And I'm telling you that because there's hundreds of years of people who have probed through this. Some of them were great grammarians and I encountered this before I even went to any other source. I encountered the problem, went, oh boy, what do you do with this? And then once you uncover it, what do you do with it? Do you leave it alone? Now, the one thing we can know, this is what Paul was trying to say to the Thessalonians, which obviously he told them something that we're not privy to know. He says, remember, I told you something when I was with you about this very thing. But the one thing we can know is that there must be a polar shift for the Antichrist to be unveiled, to be apokaluthethai, to be manifested, for him to be recognized as such, if you will. And Paul says here, the mystery, the mysterion of the lawlessness. He's the man, King James says man of sin, it's man of lawlessness. And all that means, by the way, is refusal to be ruled by the God. So that's why I'm not translating it man of sin. My Bible, in fact, labels it with a Strong's number for sin, but when you go back to the Sinaiticus reads anomia, which is lawlessness. I told you this whole section, had somebody told me I was walking into a minefield, I'm telling you, I would have said, next year, guys, we'll do it next year, right? Because maybe in September we won't have to deal with it next year. But see, there is wisdom in these things. So the first thing we want to do is we want to try and get a feel for what it is we're dealing with. And I hope, by the way, that some of you, if you're still not sure about what I'm saying, you go and check it out. I've put this out here so you can take a look at what I've done, there's no way you're going to grab hold of that in a flash. But I would definitely say, for somebody who wants to look at the information, it's important. Because what this does is, it tells me something. There are events that must happen. Traditionally, this text has been used to propose that the church must be taken out of the way before Antichrist can come to power. And I'm not suggesting that that's not the case. This is just not the text to do that with. And that's why I said these are the difficulties. It's like, if you want to know the truth, now I know there'll be people tonight listening, they'll be saying, oh, I believe this thing and that thing, and that's fine. That's like saying if you want to play dress up and you want to do that, that's your problem. I'm here to put just the facts out on the table. I'm on a journey myself. And the journey, part of that journey is encountering things that, it's just like when I started listening to Dr. Scott, and you could have just pushed me over when he said Christ was not born in December. Oh, come on. And hard-headedly, I just would not. He gave me the challenge, which I've challenged people, and he said, okay, find it. If you can find it in the Bible, there was some, I'll give you $20 or something. But I sure went looking and I did not find it. It wasn't there. And it's just like that. Okay, let me read you from some of what I would call the best scholars, to give you an idea that, as I said, unfortunately, there's no cut and dry answer, and some of the things that have been proposed are absolute insanity. Is this the one that I want first? Or no, I want the bottom one first. Okay, let me go first to the New International Greek Testament Commentary, Charles A. Wanamaker. And he does a brilliant job here. This is Erdman's. I always give credit to people when quoting or using their material. Erdmann's, part of a series. And the brilliant job that's done here is he lays out very clearly, and I've yet to find somebody who's done it this succinctly, the problems of what I've just explained. And just to hear it from somebody who probably can articulate it in a much more crystallized way, he says, these two verses are among the most problematic texts in the whole of the Pauline corpus. They presuppose knowledge to which we do not have access. No fully convincing parallels have ever been suggested, and beyond the likelihood that the materials derived from the mythical world of apocalypticism, say that 5 times, no one has put forward a satisfactory background for the verses. We must assume that Paul's original readers had the necessary knowledge based on his oral teachings, which is what I've been saying, to interpret the passage. Certainly, Paul thought they did, since he writes, kai nun oidate, and you know, or now you know, in verse 5. It would seem refers to what precedes it as well as that which follows. In addition, if I am correct in my understanding, the external circumstances of the letter, Timothy, as the bearer of the letter, would have explained anything not fully understood when he brought the letter to Thessalonica. Hold that thought. The primary exegetical difficulties revolve around the meaning of the neuter participle katekon, to katekon, in verse 6, and the masculine participle ho katekon in verse 7. Although there are other problems as well. Tell me about it. The verb katekein can be and has been interpreted in several different ways, leading to radically different understandings of the text. Do you remember what I said way back there about just the English versions? So my guarantee is that if you open up a 26 translation, or if you have comparative, amplified, New Jerusalem, any one of these, the words will have shades that will differ, and that can actually color interpretation and understanding. Before I attempt to explain the passage, therefore, a brief review of the major approaches of the problem to these two words will prove valuable. And he does an excellent job. He says, from at least the days of Tertullian, the verb katekein has been interpreted as meaning to restrain. Listen carefully. The neuter participle is understood to refer to the Roman Empire, and the masculine participle is thought to allude to the emperor. Oh boy. This view is based on the belief that Paul, as a Roman citizen, valued the protection that Roman law and the emperor, as the chief arbiter of it, offered him against his Jewish opponents and the general disorder which would have hindered his mission. Several factors have led to the rejection of this view by recent commentators, including me. In the first place, the passage is clearly not about civil rebellion, but about opposition to God. Yes, yes, and yes. Second, the imagery is drawn from the world of apocalyptic, with its mythical symbols and perspectives, not the everyday world of public law or law and order in the Roman Empire. But apart from these considerations, it is difficult to believe that Paul looked to the collapse of Roman rule as a precondition for the final denouement of the present age. So that's one. Two, another line of interpretation is going back to Cullmann, who produced a brilliant work, and I have the bulk of these. It just seemed more convenient to read how he's put these together, which will give you a clue of how no two people have understood this passage in the same light, let alone come to any agreement. So back to Cullmann, maintains that the restraining factor, neuter participle, was the preaching of the gospel, and the restrainer, masculine participle, was the apostle himself, whose task it was to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. This interpretation is problematic, and I will tell you, before I even opened any of these books, I went down this pathway. To evangelion is neutral. Why, surely that could make sense, because the apostasy, first must come the apostasy, and the apostasy has to do with a a straying away from the truth, which is why Jesus says if it be possible, even the very elect, right? But the only problem is what he's going to allude here, what he says is we could say to evangelion, the gospel. But the problem with that would be this, that the preaching of the gospel and the restrainer, masculine participle, was the Apostle Paul himself, whose task was to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Paul would not do that. In other words, he was, if it was understood that way, one would say the gospel is the restraining force, and once Paul is removed and taken out of the way, then the end will come, or the Antichrist will be revealed. That's preposterous. We know that there's some piece of information he told the Thessalonians, and that can't be part of it, because he's preparing them. He says, when that day comes, when the day of the Lord comes, so he cannot be referring to himself. Wanamaker goes on to say this interpretation is problematic. It presupposes that Paul would have been removed from the scene before the end could come, even though he expected to survive the parousia, the coming, according to 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. Marshall, who is also part of this commentary series, I believe he's a general editor. Yeah, general editor. Is also correct in questioning whether Paul considered his own role as decisive in the unfolding salvation of humankind, as this interpretation assumes. Marshall himself has suggested a variation of this view, and these are all scholars, these are all very learned people. He believes, with Cullman and another person named Monk, that the preaching of the gospel to the nations provides the reason that God has restrained the outbreak of evil. He differs from them, however, by claiming that it is not Paul, but an angel of God who serves to restrain evil until God orders his withdrawal at the appropriate time. Now, grammatically speaking, that could be plausible, because people like Michael or Gabriel are actually masculine. The only problem with this theory, oh boy, so here it comes. Why would Paul introduce angels at this point when they haven't even been addressed at all? Now, I can give abundant reference if you were to see my Bible. Which looks like a freak show, I know. But if you look at all the green circles, please go, wow, look at all the green circles in my book. Can you see those green circles? That's every time Paul says gospel. And he says it a lot, right? Just to make the point. Now you know that I have really bad eyesight. Color-coded green, the gospel. So why introduce an angel at this point? Now, some have speculated, going back to the book of Daniel and going to the book of Revelation, that the angel possessed the key. So quite possibly it could be tenable. I have issues with this. I could maybe hypothetically say the gospel in the neutral, but I just don't know about this angel thing. Let's read on though, because I want you to see how many people, and all the names that I am referencing are incredible, super smart, academic, learned. Some of them have written brilliant articles and commentaries on other books and other things. Number 3, a third very different line of interpretation takes the two participles to mean delay. In light of Habakkuk 2:3, a passage dealing with God's delay of the end of the age. This approach views God, or one of the divine angelic agents, as the one who is delaying the end, or more specifically, the coming of Christ. Okay, Best has demonstrated, that's another one, has demonstrated that this explanation has serious drawbacks, and I agree. One of them, by the way, is going to the end of this verse where it says, King James, where it says to be taken out of the way, and that is there's no active voice. Well, let me ask you a question. Could God, the Father or the Son, not have the power to remove themselves? That wouldn't be a middle deponent, it would be active. I know this is heavy, but if you see all of this, you begin to realize that a lot of these theories are broken apart by the grammar. They can't hold any weight whatsoever. And I told you at the end of this, there's no winning proposition for this. There's only the thing we can know it is not. We're going to keep going. This leaves unanswered the question of why the two different genders were employed in the first place. If the neuter refers to the will of God, thelema, one has to ask why Paul did not make this clear. This interpretation also falters on linguistic grounds. Katekein, or katekein, does not normally mean delay. In the Septuagint of Habakkuk 2:3, another Greek word is used, not this one. Moreover, Best is right, another commentator, Best is right to ask why such an imprecise language was used to refer to the activity of God, since there was no apparent need to be secretive. Good point. 4. Quite similar to the previous explanation in terms of its conclusion as proposed by Eus in God's plan, as with his study of 2 Thessalonians, Aus, who is another commentator, looks to Isaiah 66 to find the background for 2 Thessalonians 2:6. According to him, the Hebrew term asar, found in Isaiah 66:9, and referring there to the possibility of God shutting the womb or restraining birth, in a context speaking of God's restoration of Jerusalem, provided the source of the allusion in 2 Thessalonians 2:6. He assumes that the creator of verses 6 was working with the Hebrew text of Isaiah 66, that he had this in mind and simply paraphrased it, since the Septuagint does not use katekon at this point. I reject that as well, by the way, because Paul had all of the scriptures we know when he's using the rimas. He's got the precision of the Septuagint, so I reject that. It goes on. There's more points. We're only at point number 4. I'm going to skip to number 5. Another recent attempt to explain katekon is found in Giblin's Threat to Faith. He argues that katekon is to be associated with the person of rebellion, or the person, the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, from verse 3, and exists as a threat to the faith of the Thessalonians. In keeping with this, he claims that katekon means to seize or possess, and that Paul refers to a function, namely prophetic seizure, hence the neuter form of the participle in verse 6, and to some individual, hence the masculine form in verse 7, the it and the he, who was causing trouble in the community by his false prophecy concerning the imminent and present coming, or parousia, while in a state of frenzy or ecstasy. This person's removal was the condition for the coming of the person of rebellion. I have to reject that as well. It makes no sense. It's not even logical. Wanamaker goes on to say this interpretation has received little support for several reasons. One is, to me, seems obvious, but in the first place, the verb katekein normally refers to seizure in a religious sense only in the passive, not in the active. Remember, we just looked at these two verbs are participles, and they're both active, which is very important. Secondly, Giblin's very localized interpretation of the katekon seems to make the coming of Christ dependent upon the happenings in one small Christian community, whereas the event is actually to be cosmic, global, overall. So, put that aside. 6. A sixth major approach to the two participles holds, and you're going to love this one because this one's kind of like, woo, concerning an evil power and some evil person or other. In other words, the references to katekon, neutral, and masculine, singular, will refer to evil and not good forces. It takes two participles in the sense of possessing, ruling over, holding sway, or prevailing. Frame is the one who proposed this. Takes the neuter participle as referring to the principle of rebellion, and the masculine one as referring to Satan. Best, who I just referred to a few minutes ago, holds an agent of Satan rather than Satan himself, though he does not give a reason for this. Another commentator named Townsend, without finally committing himself to a particular interpretation, argues the katikon of verse 7 must be either God or the person of rebellion, since no other figures are named in this passage prior to verse 7. And he goes on to show that the problem of all of this. Now, let me just say this. If you want to use these theories, if God is being referred to, I told you the problem is the middle deponent of the word to be taken out of the way, or to be removed, to be taken out of the way, or out of the midst. Because God has all power. He has the power to remove himself. Jesus has the power to come and go. This man of sin, something must happen for him to be revealed. And when that something happens, Paul says first the apostasy, first that, and then it's almost like now we're getting a little bit more clarity. Some, and we're first going to refer to this as it, forgive me, I mean no disrespect, but whatever it is that is occupying, possessing, let's use their words here. I said I didn't want to, but they do, restraining. Let's use King James, withholding. Whatever it is that is withholding, neutral, must be removed and must be taken out of the way. He then must be taken out of the way. They're dealing with the same, the it and the he are dealing with the same issue and the same matter. So when we talk about this person proposing, for example, that this is Satan or a representative of Satan who could be removed out of the way because there is no active voice on being taken out of the way, we might just say that this, and I've got more commentaries, this is one, and he lists, he did me the favor of not having to drag about a dozen books with me in listing all of these different theories. Here is probably the most, I think, highly respected Leon Morris, coming to approximately the same conclusions, saying highly problematic. He gives us one other theory, if you will, and he suggests, Leon Morris does, that the NIV helps in the understanding of what is holding back, where they render it in their text, the one who now holds it back. He says our first problem is with the meaning of whatever the NIV renders. This is a commentary for the NIV of the NIV. Whatever the NIV renders holding back. And he goes on to do the same thing, kind of tell in a nutshell what I've just told you. He adds one thing, though, I'll just tell you. Remember, I mentioned B.B. Warfield in the writers and authors of books. B.B. Warfield identified the restraining power as the Jewish state. The masculine restrainer he thought might be James of Jerusalem. Warfield was a great exegete, and all of his opinions must be carefully weighed, but this one, in which few have been able to follow him, it's hard to understand how the Jewish state could restrain the man of lawlessness, even if we accept Warfield's other idea that this was in the line of Roman emperors. So every single one of these, and they'll all basically cite one another. Cullman is in here, and Monk and Marshall and Giblin. It's all the same pot of scholars because these are the people who've spent their time combing through this. And maybe a handful. Let me say, Leon Morris is a giant. I would say the most highly respected is F.F. Bruce. And F.F. Bruce basically does the same thing. And we have the same, using the same scholars that are mentioned again, same people are mentioned. And at least he says here, he's going to mention Darby, who is the man who proposed, who is associated with proposing the rapture as a doctrine or theory. And he says here, talking about an attempt to do justice to the interpretations made by Chrysostom and an attempt to do justice to the interpretations made by Chrysostom were done by Darby. The thing which restrained then is not that which restrains now. Here are all these people looking at the same text, and they all come up with something different. And that is because this is, as the first commentator said, the most challenging, and I'd go so far as to say outside of the Pauline corpus, perhaps, of the New Testament. Think about that. So, what do I want you to know? What I want you to know is it would be very safe to say what is not. What it is not. It would be safer to say what it is not. To infer that something must happen, which we know, the text clearly states that something must happen. First, the apostasy. Then the man of lawlessness will be revealed, the son of perdition, giving a clear depiction of what he will do, which I said if you want to match this up to the texts in Daniel 7 and in Revelation, you get a good picture. Somebody asked about what is the abomination of desolation, and if you go back to those texts, especially Daniel that I referred to, it kind of gives the better understanding. But very clearly, the one thing we can know is that Paul is saying, at present time that I am writing you, Thessalonians, at this present time, there is something, I'm using it, something, what, that is either occupying, possessing, use all the words, color all the words that you want. That is a force that, if you read carefully what the text does not read in the King James, because of the word withholdeth, which I strayed away from, that he might be revealed in his time, meaning in his time, not chronos, but kairos, in his season, when the timing, when the season is right, not when the hour. Two distinct words in the Greek. But that he might be revealed in his season, in his time, when it's right. There is something that is occupying, that is the occupying force. Now, it seems so logical to say, well, surely, Pastor, it must be the church, it must be the Spirit of God. And all I'm telling you is grammatically it's prohibitive, because that same force that is neutral is the force that says in verse 7, the mystery of iniquity, of lawlessness, is already at work. And by the way, I told you that's an important thought process. It's already at work, and it's at work for itself. It's working evil for itself. It's a middle voice verb. Only he who now letteth, he, personified now, it's a personification of a singular, not plural, not a plurality, but a personification, he that is now occupying, possessing, clinging, cleaving, however you want to describe that, until he be taken out of the way. And that is a middle, there is no active voice. That means that whoever he is, he as a singular individual, masculine individual, must be removed. Now, it's very easy to see, and we could speculate. We could say, well, it sure does. I'd like it to sound like it's the church, but as I said, the grammar prohibits it. I'd like it to sound like it's God's Holy Spirit. And it works on one half, but then it cannot become personified as a he in the masculine, singular. It doesn't work. So when I said to you, I'm treating the text, I never intended to go down this pathway. Now you can see why. Let's go back to our handy-dandy 26 translation. And after all this, I told you this is an incredible passage, incredibly challenging, that the best translators, the best linguists could not come to an agreement on because it's so challenging. Now, here, with all the information I've given you, here, 26 translation, and now you know that which restraineth, to the end that he may be revealed in his own season. This is the authorized. That makes it sound like the first part of that which is restraining, to the end that he may be revealed in his own season, sounds like it is leaning towards the evil force and not a good force. Let me say parenthetically that there's only one thing to conclude, and that is whatever is the occupying, whatever it is, that's a good way to say that, it has to be a force of good and not evil. That we know, because the Bible says you overcome, we as believers overcome evil with good. That means that this force, whatever it is holding the evil at bay. And let me just give you one more sidebar about the church. The church in its current state today, I'm talking at large. I'm not just talking Protestants, I'm not just talking Catholics, I'm talking globally, is pretty much impotent. So how could the church be the force that's holding back this force, this supernatural force that's about to eventually break loose? We know this breaking loose and to be revealed for what he really is, that occurs in that 3.5 weeks in the middle of the 3.5 years in the middle of that 7-year period, or in the middle of the week. If the church is so impotent right now that very few people would even sit listening to this amount of tedious detail and even being remotely interested, because most people, it's like, oh, I don't care. Just tell me how to get more money from God, or how to have more success. Tell me how I can have better sex, or I can pick up chicks or guys of my own, that are like me. That's what it is. So tell me how that, which is what we've become, or the most globally accepted leg of Christendom, which is the Catholic Church, which doesn't even, I'm sorry, for the most part, is so involved in humanism and the images of the Pope washing the feet, which, by the way, leave that one alone, but washing the feet of was a Syrian and Muslim immigrants. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm sorry, even if you wanted to believe that foot washing was the way, he washed the feet of his disciples. But he did it for a purpose, by the way. He didn't do it because we're all going to engage in foot washing now. If that is the force that is the arm against Antichrist, let's just throw in the bucket right now. I've never said this before, so count it as a first. But you've got ministries out there that are so full of the devil. Major ministries. Their books line shelves everywhere you go, in airports and in stores where books are still sold. And not one of these people cares to tell people about eternal principles, how to give of yourself, as Romans 12 describes, that is well-pleasing to God, but rather their concern is how they can make it easy for you here. And that is the spirit of Antichrist working, because it's the merging. That's how Antichrist will come to power, by the way. It's going to be a merging of religion and government, some form of government under the auspices that religion itself is not sufficient to be able to help the individual, so a governing body that has the power in the form of Antichrist will be able to do that. And these people they are the usher. How could they be the force? Let's now go back to that word restraining, withholding. How could the church today be that force? Not only grammatically, but I'm asking you to honestly think about something. Dr. Scott was right. There'll be pockets leading up to the last days. There'll be pockets of people. But for the most part, it's what Paul says. There will be an event, the apostasy. We have been in that realm of people falling away. Jesus said there'll be a time when people's love will, for the word of God and for God himself, will wax cold. Go into the book of Revelation and you see that last church where Jesus is standing outside the church door and knocking to come in. He's not knocking at your heart's door and will you accept him today? They have pushed him outside. Is that not pretty much the picture for the most part? In generality, in gross generality, perhaps unkindly, but truthfully, where we are today, where Christ is essentially outside, knocking to come in. And there are few churches? Yes, but there are very few. Who will take the time, especially if you are in a pocket of a denomination, where your denomination is committed to a doctrine? Any pastor would be thrown out. The deacon board or any other board governing a body of a church that is governed by that type of structure, the pastor would be thrown out to even one jot or tittle against the traditions that they have set up for themselves. Now, I think I'm not crazy when I say this. Since I'm going to give credit to the man at the back of the room for reminding me about something. In Martin Brecht's book on Luther, and it's recorded elsewhere in two other books that I have read about Luther, but at some point Luther comes under great rebuke and chastisement from his peers. The Reformation has well underway changed the way people partake of the communion. And he's coming under somewhat of a rebuke by basically saying, why didn't you get the participants to essentially get rid of some of the traditions that still are attached to Catholicism? And Luther's comeback is, well, some of these people might not understand that, and essentially they may fall away from following, so it's better to leave them alone. I think there are places in the Bible like that where it's better to leave it alone if something is so over the top. This particular passage, as I said, I didn't intend to walk into it this way, but it speaks something to me very clearly. I'll give you other passages which we might interpret as the church being removed or as people ascending up. I can give you abundant places and passages where it tells me that the gospel must be preached. Christ even said it when he gave the Great Commission. The gospel must be preached to all ends of the earth, everywhere. Unfortunately, the evangelists have warped that into thinking that as long as they have evangelized their version of the world, which may be TV satellite beaming down, and that's evangelism of the world, which it's only one form. The true form of evangelism that has never stopped is the preacher preaching, not selling books and DVDs and merchandising, which is what Paul speaks to Timothy and warning him that there will be people who will seek to make merchandise. So when we talk about this, we need to be at least on an academic level, not wanting to just roll over and say, well, this is that. We can know this one thing. As long as Christ asked the question, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith, suggests that the church itself will be so impotent before he comes. And all of the fringes are here right now. I have a very dear friend of mine who is intent on trying to push for Christians to read the Quran and to be a lot more understanding of how Muslims approach Jesus. And we had a big clashing of the worlds over this, because for the Quran, and specifically in the Quran, Jesus is just a prophet, and their Madhi, which is the 12th Imam, their awaiting deliverer, fits the description of our Antichrist. And a lot of people don't want to talk about this because we don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. But the fact of the matter is, you have to look at all this information and say, if people want to, and I have to for what I do, expose myself to the information, even the information that I'm going to reject. But I still need to expose myself to it to understand and to know what is being put out there, what people believe, how people have taken a passage to understand something. And I can tell you this, out of this one passage, the one thing that has crystallized for me is that in order to really get an understanding of the depth of Paul's understanding of what he's speaking about. We cannot even look towards anything in the New Testament. Even though Jesus spoke on many things, we need to look at how Paul understood the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophecies pointing to this time to really get a clear picture, because he was so steeped in it, to get a clear picture of what he understood. But let me go back to reading these versions. And now you know the hindrance, why he is not yet revealed in his own season. And you know now what the restraining influence, calls it an influence, is, which prevents his appearing before his appointed time. So now you know the power that is holding him back, that is to be unveiled at his own appointed time. At present, this was the one I read that I kind of chuckled a little bit. At present there is a power, you know what I mean, which holds him in check so he may not show himself before the time appointed to him. You will probably also remember how I used to talk about a restraining power which would operate until the time should come for the emergence of this man. They all like the restraining power. By the way, I should tell you one thing that I forgot to do, which is I forgot to show you one. Hold that thought. Let me finish this, and I have to show you one more thing before we go. Some of you are going, wow, I'm tired. All right. You must now be aware of the restraining hand, which ensures that he will be revealed only at the proper time. And let's go to the letteth here as well. Let me read you a few. Only he who checks it now will be able to check it, until he is removed from the enemy's path. But its activities are restricted until what I have called the restraining power is removed. And then, of course, one of them capitalizes the restrainer. Hold that thought for just 2 seconds. Out of the oldest extant Latin Vulgate, you'd never believe that I would go looking to the Vulgate. It seems to be like the last place on earth. The Amiatinus, we have the as I said, the oldest extant. Somewhere here I took the liberty of making a photocopy so that I could, with privilege, color on it. That's a photocopy of the page. But what I found very interesting is, and some of you who speak Spanish will recognize the words for the words we're looking at. Deteniat and tenet. And deteniat from de tenio, concerning, about, or from, de and tenio, tenir, to hold, to have, to possess. So it's somewhat interesting. I even parsed the Latin just to make sure I wasn't the quid, which is the neutral or neuter form of qui. So who or what or it, and concerning or that which is held. So it's somewhat interesting to me that from all of these different branches, the Coptic, the Ethiopic, oh my goodness, train wreck. And these are the earliest ones I can go to, and not one of the texts, not a one of them align, including, just for fun, if we go back to the Sinaiticus, that for me was like, well, that's gonna make sure that, and of course, there's nothing that lines up anywhere. So the reason, as I said originally, I went on this path to find out who the restrainer is, and now I need to be restrained. But what is obvious, so we can recap this right now, what is obvious is that we know one thing. This force, however we want to refer to it as, is still operating today. And until this he, person, singular, is removed out of the way, Antichrist cannot come to power. Now, I believe exactly in the mindset of what Dr. Scott was saying, using the word resist. And I think it's imperative to understand that although I'm not quite married with using the term to translate the word, I am married to the fact that it is our responsibility to resist Antichrist. When people talk about the Spirit, which is already at work here, it said in 1 John, it said, we need to understand that that Spirit is already working. Of people who would prefer for government to intervene to solve their problems, even those that are on a realm spiritual, rather than to seek out spiritual help in its truest form, or the merging of the two. This is why when they had that hearing where they wanted to have the Senator Grassley look at 6 major ministries and look at the management and the way they handled their money, because they claimed that they were mismanaging nonprofit money. And I am not going to lie to you, you'd have to be kind of empty a little bit to not, see that there's gross abuses. There's gross abuses everywhere, though. It's not limited to ministry, it's just magnified in ministry, because it just so happens that that makes it all the more sensational. We trusted you. Think of, the great words of the evangelist, saying, oh, I've sinned a great sin, forgive me, I've sinned. I'm just telling you, there's a whole intertwining that has occurred just even in the last 5 years. Some new movement now that's seeking to monitor all of the nonprofits, specifically within, I'm told, the city of Glendale. Now, when people start to monitor, when your bank starts to ask you, where's the money coming from? We need names and numbers of people, and we need to know the exactness of this. When these things are happening, when to speak the truth about God and His Word becomes hate speak, because you don't believe or accept what these other people believe, and because you don't embrace them in love and accept exactly what they believe an individual or individuals ought to be, ought to do, or ought to think, you become evil. You become the personification of evil. And all of this, we're in it. And it seems like, it's not my imagination, it seems like these things they've gone at an expedited rate. When people talk about, and I had this already, a great conversation about gay marriage, and I've told you that's not my deal. I'm not interested in that. If that's your choice, that's your choice. You work that out with God. I'm not. That's, as Dr. Scott said, that's not my side of the street. But somebody asked me if I would perform a marriage between 2 people of the same gender. And my response, and I'm going to tell you publicly, is no, I would not. And I cannot. And it's not because I don't like gay people or I don't know people who are gay and I haven't embraced the gay community. I have. I have to stand before God and give account for what I do. And that may offend some people listening. You may say, well, what does that matter? Well, that boils down to, because I do not have the same values, morals, principles, ethics as these other people, that becomes hate speak on my part. And then the government comes in and says, no, wait a minute. You're going to do this because we've just made it legal and we've made it right, and you're going to be forced to do this. So tell me where Antichrist, the spirit of Antichrist, is not working. It seems almost everywhere you turn. But let's go back to the church now, because I do believe that although the church is not stipulated here, we can take an essential essence of something and say, it seems very apparent to me that because people do not study the Word of God, people are not spending the time in the Word, there is very little of that devoted dedication as there was perhaps, we'll say 50 years ago even, where people went to Bible school or they devoted themselves to that. People were actually devoting themselves to know and to pursue. And there's less and less of that today. So how will people know the difference between Antichrist workings? Paul says it right here. He says, the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders, pseudo wonders. Not that they are false or fake, but they're done in the spirit of falsehood. How will people be able to distinguish? and they can't even distinguish now. And people say, well, so such and such an evangelist or such and such a person who makes these predictions, they can't even discern it now. They can't even discern between a charlatan and somebody who's sincerely, honestly wanting to guide people to at least some form of doctrine. And you're going to tell me that the church, just starting about this point, will even be able to discern? A man working great wonders. I'm sure he'll come with healing power and he'll heal people. And people will flock to his. It'll be the greatest evangelistic healing meeting that's ever been seen. And people will go and they will not be cognizant. They won't even be aware. Why? Because they're not even in the Word. This is what I said when we talk about a force, although the text prohibits me to say this is that, I am saying this is why we must be vigilant. And in the words of Dr. Scott, to resist the spirit of Antichrist. I know, even on something like this, I risk people saying, well, I can't handle what you're saying. And that's why I said I put the information out there for you. Don't be lazy. For you to go and check me out. For you to do the research. And to not go through the motions of your Christendom as though, as somebody earlier today said, as though, you know, you take something and you just take it as it is. You never question anything. Now, there comes a point when asking so many questions can become irritating. But the fact of the matter is, if you're wanting to pursue the nubbin of something, the core, you have to ask the questions and you have to probe. Now, how will this affect, and why should we know this here? Why did I do this? Because I would like to discuss the rapture, and I'd like to find the passages. If someone is going to propose a theory, propose it on passages that have substance and that are relative to that particular event with supportive grammar and context in the bulk of everything. So, as I said, I want to be able to present things that have something sound. If you must argue something to somebody, I want you to be able to argue it with intelligence. If you have to defend your faith, defend it with things that are substantive, that are concrete, that are not ambiguous. It's like the reference Dr. Scott used to say about why he doesn't like the song, "He lives." You ask me how I know he lives within my heart. Well, that's subjective. That's just an emotive statement. It may be a great statement, but it's just that, and it cannot defend your faith. Which is why he made the resurrection such a pivotal center point of his whole ministry. And I would say the same thing about any form of doctrine. Present the things that you can stand on and present with substance, not with just some vague whatever. So I told you there was not going to be some, you know, here I am saying something and he said something, but rather I'm putting it out there to say this is one where perhaps over the course of time, as I've shared with you 4 or 5 commentaries, it seems that most people who've combed the scriptures at large could not come to one agreement. But one thing I can tell you for certain is that God knows, and in his time, when the Antichrist is revealed, all I know is my job is to prepare people to have the deepest, closest understanding of the Word of God, which can draw you to greater faith. And as that faith grows, the confidence that God will take care of his people, that he loves us, that he intends to make good on his words that he's declared as he's declared them in the past and made good on those that were prophetic but now history and fulfilled. He will do the same for the things that lie yet ahead of us, from the tomorrow, which is very shortly, to whenever the end of time is, whatever that is. So if the purpose, I would say tonight, the purpose is this: don't go into a subject with blinders on. Open your eyes, be open to receive the information, and as I said, at the end of what I'm doing, if you still feel married to a tenet that you've held, even though I've presented adequate information and substance, I'm not going to condemn you, I'm not going to criticize you, but just know that I'm not interested in walking around on straw theories. I'm looking for concrete evidence to build a specific doctrine, to lay down some tracks that in the midst of all the confusion I can say at least this foundation was laid. Are there gray dots still? Absolutely. But this core thing, this will be here and will stand the test of time. I hope You're not all sleeping, but you're going to let me know that you're not by getting on the telephone. Come on, get busy.